Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I'm Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a psychotherapist and the author of 3 nonfiction books about trauma and or psychotherapy. A Light in the Darkness, Into the Fire, and America in Therapy, the first 2 of which are part of the Road Home series. Her name is Phyllis Leavitt, and my interview with Phyllis will follow the teleportation sound. Phyllis Leavitt, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
I'm going to start with a rather sensitive question. What was your childhood trauma healing journey like, and what is your work as a psychotherapist like?
Yeah, my healing journey was from child sexual abuse, and it was a difficult journey, as probably anybody who has experienced that could tell you, for a number of reasons, partly because the emotions that are associated with being hurt by other people are very deep and they're very painful. They can be scary, they can be confusing sometimes. And I know that for me, that part of it was that I felt very unlovable as a result, which I think is a very common result of being hurt. And so there was just a lot of layers to peel back and to really, because underneath, I really believe no matter what happens to us with other people, that there is this beautiful, innocent, pure, essential self that is not harmed by anything that people do to us. It just gets kind of covered over. And so the work of therapy is really peeling back those layers in a safe place with a safe person or safe people to reconnect with what our most essential self is. And that really was what my journey was like. It was, I worked with a number of different people, and I, remembered some of what happened to me and reprocessed that and really did make that connection in a very powerful way. So that was really what my healing journey was like, kind of in a nutshell. And it inspired me to become a psychotherapist myself. When I first began the work that I did personally, I don't think I really believed that there was going to be light at the end of the tunnel, but I found that there really is. And so I think sometimes when we receive something really beneficial and healing ourselves, we just want to be that for other people. And I think that's kind of what inspired my journey to become a psychotherapist, and really do my very best to hold that light for other people while they made their own journeys through whatever, they came to heal. So that was what that was like.
Your first 2 books are called A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire. Without spoiling too much of your first 2 books, what are each of them about?
They were really about that journey. And so the beginning of the first book, A Light in the Darkness, is very autobiographical. It's really about that, about kind of my childhood, how I had, even with what I had experienced, and not all of my childhood was terrible. There were good things in my childhood. I got a good education. In other ways, I had a safe community around me. I had friends. I went to a good college. I was a good student. So there were, I had a love of learning. So there were good things also, and I think there were strengths. I always had an attraction and an interest in writing. So it was probably inevitable that I would write about my healing journey in those 2 books, A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire. And the beginning is very, very autobiographical about my growing up and kind of these breakthrough experiences that I did have. I did have a very profound connection through nature and through writing to what I would call divine love. But those experiences were very few, very far between. And so I wanted more of that. And I think that was part of the motivation to find a way to heal. So the first two books really chronicle what I went through and what happened when I really had this amazing opening to a very essential, very knowledgeable part of myself that I would say was really, really offered me incredible guidance about what my soul was doing here in the experiences that Phyllis Leavitt was having as a personality and in a body and with other people. So there was a perspective that was very kind and very loving, that I wasn't being punished. I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't paying some horrible karmic debt. I really had come to make my way from darkness into light and to share that with other people. So that's what the first two books are about. And I go into great detail about what that guidance looked like and what the experience was of receiving that guidance. And how it really helped me navigate some of the problematic relationships that I was in at the time, including my first marriage, which I was eventually able to leave because I wasn't able to work it out, and it was not healthy for me. And I don't know, without doing that healing work, if I had been able to do that, if I would have been able to do that.
Without spoiling too much of your latest book, which is titled America in Therapy, what is that book about?
Yeah, and I don't mind spoiling what it's about, let me tell you. So really out of my own healing work and then becoming a therapist and working really with hundreds of people over the years, I worked with children and families and couples and individual adults. I was privy to how much abuse and neglect is really happening, whether it's emotional or physical or sexual or societal, that so many people in America are experiencing today, and really all over the world. Obviously, people who are caught in wars and who are discriminated against as en masse for their gender, for their religion, for their race. People have many people have no access to either escape from what's hurting them from other people, abuse, neglect, and violence, or have no access to any kind of treatment. So I wanted to really share what I had learned, in a book, because I knew that there were so many people like myself who had no idea of why they had the symptoms they had, why they have depression or anxiety, why they're addicts, why they're people pleasers, why they're obsessed, why they become rigid in their beliefs or they have no boundaries, why they end up attracting people into their lives that are just like the people that hurt them, which is a very common outcome, which I did the first time around. So I really wanted to share what I had learned about psychology on that level with a wider audience, because I don't think a lot of that is actually common knowledge. And the second big impulse in writing the book was, how do we look at America? How do we look at a nation, which is a collection of people that are operating on family dynamics, and the same dynamics that families operate on. And we kind of know that in the world of psychology, that groups tend to run on the same hierarchical, either healthy family dynamics where everybody's needs are considered and there's also a consideration for the good of the whole, or they're run on a continuum from dysfunction to overt and extreme abuse, where people are really targeted and alienated, they're ostracized, or they're physically or sexually assaulted. And we have so much of that going on in the family of America. And I see and have seen that with so many of the people that I worked with, that I felt like I really needed to.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'm all right.
Oh. I felt like I needed to write about that to help us begin to understand some of the divisiveness and violence that is escalating here in America, because I think the lens of looking at what we do as a country, the lens of family dynamics and the parts we play and the parts we've learned to play and the parts we force each other to play, mirror what happens in dysfunctional and abusive families. And therefore, I think as a country, we really need some of the principles of healing that we have learned in the world of psychology. What helps break the cycle? How do people heal? How do they stop behaving in ways that are harmful? Because and the reason why I think it's a mental health issue rather than a partisan issue or an ideological issue at its core is because mentally healthy people don't kill other people. They don't target others for discrimination or violence or hatred or withholding resources. Mentally healthy people, are cooperative. They're committed to nonviolent conflict resolution. They're committed to tolerating diversity and even celebrating diversity, and so many other things that healthy families do. They love and they enjoy each other, and they're really committed to working out their problems, which we all have, without hurting each other as much as humanly possible. And if we could bring some of those healing principles to our country, I think that we could make some massive and desperately needed changes before we have further violence, really.
What are the easiest and hardest parts of writing nonfiction books for you, as you've written 3 nonfiction books?
Right. Well, the first 2 books were somewhat easier than the third book, I have to say, because just writing out of your own personal experience for me, was not as difficult. Writing the nonfiction book of America in Therapy was definitely way more challenging because I wanted very much, I had the structure that I had in my mind was to find some balance between sharing some of my personal experience, including client case studies and professional observation. And then along with that, to back up some of my own observations from the world of my own experience as a therapist, to back that up, I needed to do research about how some of the issues and the dynamics that I'm talking about are actually playing out in our society today. So I needed to do a lot of research for the book as well, which was not anything I had ever done before. But writing the book from those 4 perspectives was actually taught me a lot, and I think made the book more effective.
Morgan James Publishing published America in Therapy. What was it like to work with Morgan James to get America in Therapy published, and were you represented by a literary agent?
I was not. I had worked previous to Morgan James. I had worked with a really good editor and an editorial kind of program. And by the way, let me just say that writing a nonfiction book, I would not advise anyone to do that without a good editor, because that was really a very significant and powerfully effective part of what I did, and really added to, I think, the quality of the book that I ended up writing. So I had worked with someone who helped me prepare a proposal package for publishing that I submitted to Morgan James, and they accepted me on the basis of that package. I forget what you call it, but it's like a proposal, for a book proposal that has many different components in it, and they helped me make that proposal. Working with Morgan James, so I felt very blessed to be accepted by Morgan James, and it's a wonderful publishing company. They're very involved with their authors. They're very helpful. They're always available. I think they're wonderful. It's been a really good experience.
Now, did Morgan James Publishing publish your first 2 books, A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire? And if not, how were those 2 books published?
They didn't. I self-published those 2 books. And there's something to be said for self-publishing. Certainly, in some ways easier, in some ways not. But it was the only option that I thought was available to me at the time. I just had no idea about the publishing world, so I self-published. The downside is, for me, and it may not be true for other people, but for me, because I really don't have a following, that's not something that I worked on promoting or gathering over the years, because I was just really doing one-on-one work with people. It's hard to market your book if you're a self-published author, because you just don't have, you have to just generate the whole thing yourself. And with a publisher, there's some help in marketing, and there's also with Morgan James, there's been a lot of coaching around marketing. So, but I don't think self-publishing is a bad way to go, and many people do it very successfully.
I would also add that for independent authors like myself, book marketing requires a completely different skill set than writing or even editing a book.
You are so 100% right about that. And it's a skill set that I never had, never necessarily even wanted to have or thought I could develop. And so I've done a lot of work with other people to help me with that. I've, worked with coaching around marketing. I hired a PA firm for a couple of months when my book went live. And I continue to get coaching around marketing because it really is it's a very intense skill set that you need in the world of book publishing today because partly because there are just so many authors out there. There's hundreds and thousands of self-published books coming on the market all the time. And I know from Morgan James that they received, thousands more requests to publish their books than they were able to fulfill. And I think most publishers are probably in that position.
What do you believe accounts for the prevalence of violence and hatred in a lot of segments of America today?
Yeah. I think it's a perfect storm of many factors that are happening. I think that technology has been a factor. I think that as good as so many technologies are and life-saving and providing comfort for us and immediate access to information and communication, that I think in many ways we've lost like personal and immediate connection to one another. And I think a loving, safe connection to other people is the foundation for peace and safety. And when that gets disrupted, when we're focused so much on acquisition rather than on relationship suffers. So I think that's one factor. And I think it's a big one and kind of a growing one that I think we all need to be really have our alarms out for how to manage that in our own lives. I think that's one factor. I think probably even a bigger factor than technology and social media, which, as we know, can be used for good or ill, is the fact that psychology is a relatively new field. That I think up until very recently, the mindset of most human beings has been that there's just good people and bad people. And the good people are supposed to fight the bad people and kill them if necessary, or get rid of them in some other way, or conquer them, or subdue them, or make them, force them to behave a different way. And I think in the world of psychology, and I think that's been that story about humanity, that there are good guys and bad guys, and good is fighting evil in some epic battle, has been going on maybe since the beginning of human culture. I'm not sure, but certainly conquest and submission have been going on. And I think we have to have a new story. I think, and the story that psychology offers, that I said, as I said, is relatively new, is that we are a product of our conditioning in so many ways. Yes, I believe we're born with our individual natures. Some people are born more introverted or more extroverted or more mathematically inclined or more artistic or more loving, and some people are just more aggressive, maybe by nature. But our nurture from other people has a huge significance in the ways that we learn to behave toward ourselves and other people, and how we deal with conflict, and how we deal with love, and how we deal with expectations, and and a million other, the values we have, a million other things we learn from the people around us. And one of the things that I talk about, one of the many things I talk about in my book, is that in America, many, many, many of the original settlers that came here And many of the people that immigrated here in following centuries after the original settlers fled poverty. They fled war. They fled religious persecution. They fled political persecution. Not everyone, but many did. And they brought their traumas with them that were unhealed, that they repeated and played out in various ways. And I talk about that in detail in my book, what it looks like when we play out our traumas if we don't get healing and we don't get help and we don't get rescue. And so we have an ancestry here, and of course, many people around the world do in their own countries of origin. We have an ancestry here that has a legacy of unhealed trauma that got passed down and reenacted by future generations without knowing that it was a psychological trauma to flee war or persecution or see your loved ones killed or starved or, have to leave your home and your belongings behind with no certainty about what your future would look like. We know today that those experiences can be psychologically hugely traumatic for people, and they become symptomatic. And without help, they'll act those symptoms out. And that's what the world of psychology has to offer us now, that we come from a legacy of a lot of trauma. We also come from a legacy of a lot of trauma that we have inflicted. We massacred, untold numbers of Native Americans. We enslaved Black people and tortured many of them and, robbed them from their homes and their families and took their children away from them. And those are just two really big examples. But the ways as a country that we have reenacted some of our traumas in terms of inflicting them on other people have continued through the centuries. And we carry that whole legacy individually and collectively, just like one person who comes from an abusive or neglected family carries that legacy of trauma, unhealed trauma with them, and will tend to act it out either, with many different kinds of symptoms, like I've mentioned earlier, like anxiety or depression or aggressiveness or rage or addiction or whatever. But also the two main ways that we tend to act out unhealed trauma are either to become very passive and submissive because we had to be to survive whatever the abuse was or the violence was that was being directed at us, or the other half of the population identifies with the aggressor and becomes like the aggressor. So we have more and more people who have been conditioned to submit and have learned to be helpless and manipulatable. And we have more and more people who have learned that the way to survive is to become aggressive and overpower other people. And I think that, those two groupings of psychological configurations, I guess I would say, tend to be attracted to each other. And I saw this all the time in my practice, that people who had learned to be more submissive because they were hurt worse if they resisted tend to be drawn to people who are dominating and often over-controlling and hurtful. And people who have identified with the aggressor look for people who they can dominate. And so we have that playing out in our homes, we have it playing out in our communities, and we have it playing out from the highest levels of government. And often people who are in positions of power really have unhealed issues around power that they then play out on the larger populations that they have power over. And this is very new thinking. Again, it's very different lens than the good guys are going to kill the bad guys. And we need this lens because I think it's a much truer lens about what's really happening. And, the subtitle of my book is A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. We need that lens to have hope that there is healing possible in an individual family with a lot of work, with a lot of commitment, with a lot of dedication. And it's possible to break the cycle of abuse and not repeat it. And if it's possible for individuals and individual families, it's possible for communities, and it's possible for nations, and it's possible for a global human population. And that's really where I'm coming from and what I want to share in terms of the nuts and bolts of what I think we could begin to implement as a country to reverse this escalation in divisiveness and violence and discrimination and injustice.
My last question for this interview: what are the best principles and practices you would recommend for breaking the cycle of abuse and violence?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a whole chapter devoted to that. Well, I have more than one chapter devoted to that in my book, but one of them, there are actually 4 chapters devoted. Well, actually, there's probably 6 anyway devoted to that. Half the book is really about the diagnosis, and half the book is about the cure. But there's one chapter in particular where I talk about how we could begin to reverse that in our own lives. And there are 6 main principles of that, but they all have to do with one principle, and that is that I stop blaming other people and take responsibility for my own part in what's going on. And that doesn't mean, let me just say this up front, that doesn't mean that if someone just walks up and smacks me in the face or hits me over the head, that I have some responsibility for that. I don't. People who are just targeted and abused are not to blame for what happens to them. But in a less threatening situation where there's just high conflict or a lot of aggressive behavior or deep disagreement that people can't resolve and they become alienated or hateful toward one another, and act out in other ways on one another. The bottom line for how we can all begin to break that cycle is to focus on ourselves and take responsibility for our own behavior. Can I restrain my worst reactions to you when I'm angry at you or hurt by you or scared of you? Can I not call you names? Can I not slam the door and walk out? Can I not enroll other people to gang up on you? Can I not roll my eyes when you're talking or make disgusted sounds or, face away and not make eye contact with you? On all levels, can I take responsibility for my reactions to you? Can I take responsibility for the fact that I may have a part in the conflict? It may not all be you. There may be some way that I'm being toward you or something I've said to you that has hurt you or upset you. Can I be open to listening to that and not become defensive or attacking? So restraining my own worst reactions is one part, taking responsibility and really reflecting on myself. Like, what's my motivation in this? What am I trying to get out of the relationship? Are my motivations something that I actually feel are part of my own integrity or not? Am I willing to apologize and make amends to you if I've been in the wrong? And likewise, am I willing to accept your sincere apology and your amends? Because sometimes we're not. We're just like pissed at the other person. And no matter what they do, we're just not willing to let them back in. Am I willing to accept a sincere apology and amends from another person? Am I willing to sit down with you and look for ways that we could resolve this? Are there agreements we could make? And sometimes, when people, I say this, the real bottom line for all of this, in answer to your question, and it's encapsulated in these elements that I'm trying to share, is can we treat other people the way we want them to treat us? Because that's really the resolution to all of it. If I behave toward you when I'm angry at you, the way that I would most like you to treat me when you're angry at me, and if we could do that as communities and states and governing bodies, we would be on the road to peace. It might be difficult to attain, it might be even more difficult to maintain, but we would be on that road. So the last 2 elements, am I willing to sit down and look at what would actually create resolution with you on a practical level? Like, I need you to do this, you need me to change that. And on an emotional level, am I willing to have compassion for myself and for you, that we did the best we could, even though it wasn't good, and that we're willing to learn something new? And the last element, am I willing to extend, my hand, a white flag, and reconnect with you? And because that's really what we all want. We all want love and connection. We all want safety and peace. We all want to be provided for. We all want to be tolerated for the ways that we're different from other people and even celebrated for our diversities. So can we behave toward other people the way we want them to behave toward us? And that's, it's very simple to say, very hard sometimes when we're triggered or hurt or angry, or we really disagree. It's really hard to put into practice. But that's the workout, because what I always say is it's easy to fight. It's easy to make war, actually. We just follow our, automatic unconscious reactive patterns. It's harder to become aware of how we can take responsibility to change what's going on. And one of the things that I learned in graduate school about relationships that I've never forgotten is that one person can change a relationship. If I don't agree to fight with you the way that we've been fighting, if I focus on taking responsibility for myself, I'm committed to nonviolence with you, I'm committed to resolving this with you, you won't be able to play your old part with me the way you did before. It's like a dance partner. If I'm out of step, you're going to be out of step too. If I move with you, if I relate to the way you're leading me, or I'm leading you, if we can do that together, then the dance changes.
Phyllis, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for your great questions. I really appreciate it.
Phyllis was a fascinating guest to interview. As Americans, we've been through a lot. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.